Good evening, and thank you for having me tonight. I have prepared this PowerPoint, which is a summary of the verbal valuation and process that was presented at the last board meeting. Also, to summarize the appraisal report, the written report that was conducted after the last board meeting, and to address the 2020 valuation. So again, the appraisal assignment was to determine the market value of the subject property, which is the previous executive golf course. I broke this down into two sections. The north portion, which was 55 acres and included an additional 11.6 acres for that was donated, or approximately 66 acres that was the quote purchase property in January of 2024, and then the 41.5 acre option property, which is the south property. The purchase and option agreement, it's important to understand that the entire purchase price of roughly $19,950,000 for the 108 acres was negotiated at one time. It was all negotiated in November of 2023 as a total purchase. And this is very common for developers. As by way of an example, developers will often purchase finished lots for building homes, and they may negotiate a price of on 200 lots to purchase, but they want to take down or purchase those lots over time. And they might break that up into 50 lot purchases over 1 or 2 years. From the appraisal perspective, that transaction was based on the price for the 200 lots, not the individual 50 lot purchases that happened along the way. So in this case, it's based on the contract price for the total property at 19,950,000. And my understanding is the 41.6 or 41.5 acres, the line was arbitrarily drawn to accommodate the multiple purchase or takedown of the property. Market value, probable price as of the date of value, and key elements, buyer and seller, are typically motivated. Public agency purchases are not typically motivated based on the definition of value, and therefore we don't consider those in the appraisal. They're private transactions. And also key is that the buyer and seller are fully knowledgeable of the uses of the property, which speaks to the highest and best use. So once we know the assignment and the market value, I've done an outline of the appraisal process. So starting with on-site inspection, that is absolutely critical for a property like this. I did go on site prior to the last board meeting, inspect the property, and the next phase then goes to subject and market research. The subject property is research based on legal and physical attributes, and then market research to determine whether or not and what the demand looks like for that typical property type. That'll all lead into highest and best use that we'll talk about here in a minute on what that entails. But the highest and best use does dictate the sales that are appropriate for the property, and we do personally confirm and inspect those comparable sales. I went to every one of the comparable sales to look at the area and property for the comparisons with the subject, and ultimately, after comparisons are made, that will result in a market value of the property. So the subject, key characteristics, it's at a major intersection off Highway 50 at El Dorado Boulevard. There's significant adjacent commercial and residential development, commercial along El Dorado Hills, just west of the property, and Serrano development, so significant residential, high traffic and offsite infrastructure in place. But we did also consider the fact that it would require significant open space for buffer and a wetland area. I was aware of the creek along the western boundary, and there are some identified wetlands involved in the creek and also some ponding in that portion of the property, but that was certainly considered in the significant open space requirement for development of the property. And then we looked at market demand for similar properties, and that demand did exist for these large properties that have high constraints, which is anything that affects the cost or risk of a project in the market, and a couple that were very close to the property. So highest and best use is that use that creates the highest value. And it's a pivotal step in the appraisal process because it dictates the appropriate comparables. By way of example, if I'm appraising a commercial property and it could either be developed to office or retail, and we know the office market is appraisers is very low right now, and that land value would be very low as a result, but well-positioned retail properties would sell for much higher. So retail will be the conclusion of highest and best use, and we would look for well-positioned retail properties that are sales to dictate what that value is. Sorry, my. So the 2020 appraisal, this appraisal was completed by Jared Calabrese for the previous general manager of the district. And it's important to understand that appraisals are specific to the individual and not the firm. Jared was a partner in the firm. He had signing authority. He directly contracted with the district on the assignment, and I had absolutely no involvement in the engagement of the project, any assumptions that were made, or the conclusions in the appraisal. But I did go to the archives and pull the appraisal up, and what struck me is that the appraisal was based on a critical, extraordinary assumption. And that's an important note, and that was listed throughout the report with the conclusions. Every appraisal has general assumptions and limiting conditions, and there's a myriad of them, but they include things like the title is marketable or that we haven't surveyed the boundaries of the property. Those are not specific to the assignment at hand, but an extraordinary assumption is specific to the assignment. And his extraordinary assumption in the report was that the property would remain as recreational facility and open space into perpetuity. When you look at the comparable sales, none of the sales had any development potential. These were properties that were not buildable, could barely access them, heavy tree cover in some cases, very remote locations. And the sales, along with the extraordinary assumption, resulted in a conclusion that was not based on market, but rather based on the extraordinary assumption. And it was not buildable land. And that's not my understanding of the property, that we can't do anything with the entirety of their property. There is potential for building on the site. So now we look at the 2025 report, and the conclusion was based on market data for the existing zoning and general plan. The buyer would be a developer that would purchase for the chance to build in the entire site, and the Central El Dorado Hills specific plan was not considered in that analysis. So the conclusion is on a developer taking a chance to build on the site versus the 2020 report that said there would be no potential for that. So the differential in value is no way influenced by market conditions, but rather an extraordinary assumption that affected the highest and best use, the comparables that resulted from that highest and best use, and that were not economic uses. So I also looked at the restrictive covenant, option exhibit E, where the seller agreed to restrict future development to current general plan and zoning if the buyer does not execute the option. This was executed after the Planning Commission recommended to deny the specific plan adoption in June of 2022, and it can be amended, terminated, or removed by mutual agreement. Now, an appraisal is by definition a the basic premise is the sale of the property to a typical buyer in the market, which is a developer. But that would mean that the property would no longer be in ownership by Parker Development, but rather a different developer. And my understanding is that if Parker Development does not own the property, then a general plan amendment and zoning change is a possibility in the property. And again, because of the unique location and the surrounding uses of the property certainly would attract a developer to try and develop it to higher intensity, certainly not to the level of the specific plan, but try and develop to more commercial or recreational that would be on the economic side, or be more financial motivated if they could get it. So the sales comparison approach from the next phase now, after the highest and best use, we look for large property that had development constraints. And in our case, topography, I mentioned the wetlands and um, the riparian areas, ponds that would have to be part of the open space, which would be a very large requirement. Now, there's also in the option agreement the extension of Country Club Lane. This is in the planning phase, and there's a preliminary exhibit that shows the extension running through the middle of the option property. Now, this is a very big property, and that road is intended to make a connection to Serrano Development. So it does bring more traffic onto the property, and my experience working with the El Dorado County Department of Transportation is that when they get to the final design, and if there is some type of development there, they'll do their best to work with the developer to find a route for Country Club that would hopefully minimize any damages to the property or constrain the property more. So this was the sales table that was in the report that I discussed in the last meeting. Sales range from $3.68 a foot to $5.77 per square foot. We made comparisons between the sales and the property appraised, which resulted in a bracketing, we call it. And these two particular sales, sale one at the bottom was the Rockland sale that had about a 70% requirement for open space, a huge riparian area they had to deal with, sloped down below Interstate 80 with no freeway exposure, no direct access off the highway. And granted, we did also consider, though, that it had zoning, but they could only develop a really small part of that property because of physical constraints. And then sale two was Silva Parkway at $4.58 per foot. Again, they had street extensions required, utility extensions required, and that intersection, the Highway 50 is over the top of Silva Parkway, so exposure isn't the best. But again, we did consider also with that comparable the fact that they had zoning already that might dictate that they could develop something more now, but offset by a lot of inferior attributes as well. That resulted in a range from 368 to 458 per square foot, and the conclusion in the appraisal of $20 million for the entire property, which is consistent with the purchase and option agreement at roughly $19,950,000. And that's my presentation.
Yes, I do. I just want to confirm something here. We have presently zoned for high intensity sports or whatever. And what we're being told here is Exhibit E, because it can be Parker Development can sell this property to another group, if you will. He could sell it to his own daughter. And if he did that, that person would be able to go back in and get new zoning for that property. And therefore, the value of the property has to be contingent upon that remote possibility. That's what I'm hearing, but I'm not sure I'm right. So maybe Mr. Rock could elaborate on that just a little more.
Absolutely, Mr. Perry. When we look at the comparable data in the sales, we're looking for properties that have quite a few unknowns. Unknowns with what they can actually get on the property, what the constraints would be, what utility requirements are, and that's why those are the best. That's why that's the best data. And what I'm suggesting is that if there was a possibility, which we believe there is, that if it's not under Parker Development's ownership, that there's a possibility for a zoning change, general plan amendment, that a developer would be attracted to this site because of where it is, what it is, and how it's positioned for some potential future development. And that's consistent with the comparable data, especially the two that are most similar to us, that people are taking the chance to buy a property and develop it because of where it is, even though there's no guarantee or certainty that that'll be approved, but they will take the chance, and they have.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions that the board may have?
David, this is Heidi. There's been some comments about the community commercial value. Do you have anything to add about how that was evaluated?
Yeah, the community commercials in the north part of the property, and again, it was appraised as the market would buy this as one property for the most flexibility. It's a small zone, and it didn't have a huge impact on the value of the property. It's up on the northern portion, but the donated property does front El Dorado Hills Boulevard. So it was a consideration, but it's a very small component of the zoning relative to the RFH recreational facility.
Thank you.
Question, when you are doing the evaluation, do you ever look at the purchase price that the current owner paid at all? Just out of curiosity.
I'm sorry, current owner being the district, the recent purchase and the contract?
Sorry, prior that we are trying to purchase from.
We're required by our standards to report and analyze any sales within 3 years of the appraisal date. Anything beyond that, we have no requirement to look at that and analyze that purchase, but within 3 years, we do have to.
Didn't think you did, but thank you.
You bet.
And I guess one question for me, just to confirm and just make sure that, right, the current zoning as is recreational high intense, correct? Not open space?
David, can you hear the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear it.
Director Martinelli, would you
was
repeat?
just-
Sorry about that.
It was just the current zoning, recreational high intense, not open space.
Correct. I believe there's a small portion of open space, or there's a portion of open space zoning on the north parcel, which is RFH community commercial, and I think there is open space, but that's mainly due to the slope. The topography and the slope, I think, is a buffer, but that's all been incorporated into the analysis, understanding there would be a large open space requirement for that property to develop.
And again, the whole highest and best use, the way that it's coming into this is the fact that a lot of the comparables are similar in nature in terms of the development opportunity that's there in terms of the building and construction that could potentially go there.
Correct. It's the exposure on the highway. It's where it's situated in El Dorado Hills, and these are unique sites from that perspective. If there was a known development in place, these properties would have sold for far, far more. But these are reflecting all the unknowns with development, but also demonstrate that people are in the market are buying these properties on that potential to develop the property.
Very good. Thank you for that.
You bet.
And just so I understand, so with the current zoning, things like bowling alley, Topgolf, those kinds of things, we have a lot of new faces in the crowd tonight, so just can you kind of go over some things that could go there?
Absolutely. And on the recreational facilities high intensity, I didn't include the slide in this meeting, but you could have a recreational private sports complex. In fact, there's one that's proposed on Prairie City Road to meet the demand of recreational uses in the market. Topgolf could go there. There's also possibility with a conditional use permit for retail development as well, and hotel motel development potentially with a use permit. But again, that's more risk and more unknowns if that would actually be obtainable. But the community commercial is more of your standard uh, neighborhood serving commercial retail uses. But again, that's a small component, and it would likely be sited on the north parcel near El Dorado Hills Boulevard.